Prometheus took the bones of the animal, but then covered it in the fat of the animal and burned it so that it smelled like fried food, right? And then in option B, he took the stomach of the animal, but he put all the meat in the stomach, and he kind of just left the stomach there, and Zeus wasn't Cajun, so he wasn't interested in pulse. Okay, so Zeus looked at the fat and the bones and said, I want that. And then when he realized that he had taken what was basically the waste of the animal, he was very upset, right? And things happened after that. The reason I bring this up is because this kind of story, this kind of myth, is very common in the ancient world. How do we offer sacrifice without really offering sacrifice? In other words, in the memorable saying of St. John Henry Newman, most people do not try to please God. They try to please themselves without displeasing God too much. And that instinct is present in all the ancient world in a variety of ways. There was not a lot of trust between the ancient peoples and their gods. And the Romans even summed this up in a wonderful Latin saying, do ut des, I give so that you give. In other words, my sacrifice is transactional. Here's my money, give me my pants, and we'll move on from now on, okay? Sadly, this struggle with sacrifice, with the nature of sacrifice, is something that infected even the Jewish people. And we see this repeatedly throughout the history of the Old Testament. Especially in the northern kingdom of Israel is where they had a lot of problems with this, and it's not incidental that the northern kingdom was the richer one. And so they kind of looked on their relationship with God in a very transactional way, right? We can sin as much as we want as long as we offer the sacrifices prescribed in Leviticus, and then you're going to protect us, right? And if you don't protect us, then we're within our rights to go sacrifice to Baal. Okay. Dear brothers and sisters, the reason I bring this up and all these things up is because we need to face this reality. Sacrifice is a universal human phenomenon, and trying to get out of sacrifice is a universal human phenomenon. And if it's universal, that means that it applies to us too. And so we come today to celebrate Jesus, who offers a sacrifice that radically upends the entire idea of sacrifice. First of all, instead of a human offering sacrifice to God, it's God offering the sacrifice of himself to himself, which is profound. But the second thing I want to say, and this wrapped up in this title of Jesus Christ, priest and victim, is that in sacrifice you always offered something else. Now that something else was supposed to cost you, whether it was the first fruits of your harvest or the best of your rams, but we know again and again and again and again that the idea that I'm offering something else other than myself means that I'll try to wiggle out of the self-sacrifice part as much as possible. And we hear that even in the prophet Malachi, who says that the Jewish people had taken to bringing the lame, the blind, the sick animals to the temple so that their destruction wouldn't cost them anything. But Jesus instead, as we hear today in the gospel, offers himself. So he's both the one who offers and he's the one who is offered. I know you know this. I know this is not some earth-shattering insight or revelation to you. But I want to take that foundation and reflect on it and spend some time with it and ask ourselves, are we sacrificing like Christ? Or are we sacrificing like Prometheus? So one way to look at this is when we think of sacrifice, when we think of offering sacrifice, when we think of offering the sacrifice of the Eucharist, when we think of the sacrifice of the cross, one thing that our theologians, and good theologians, doctors of the church, including St. Anselm, who's very dear to me, theologians talk about the sacrifice of the cross, and they talk about it in terms of substitution. Yeah? Jesus died so I don't have to, right? Jesus offered a sacrifice to God to wipe away my sin. He substituted for me. And that is true, but it's not the entire truth. And a lot of times, maybe you don't struggle with this, I struggle with this all the time. A lot of times we hear that word substitution, and that can breed resentment in us, right? Lord, if you died for me, why do I have to go through all this mess? All right? Like, if you suffered the cross for me, then why do I still need to bear it? And yet, while there is a truth to the fact that Jesus substituted for us because he did something that we could have never done, nevertheless, it's not mere substitution. He also calls us to participation. That his sacrifice is not something that is done in place of ours. It's something that's done as an example for ours. And that in and through him, we too offer the sacrifice of ourselves, becoming both priest and victim. No fun, but there it is, right? That's what the Lord invites us to, and we'll come back to why that is in a bit. But I want to hold that up to you because it helps us understand something like when St. Paul says something that is radically something that makes a lot of people struggle. When he says, I'm filling up in my body what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Well, what could possibly be lacking in the sufferings of Christ? Me. That's what's lacking. My participation in them, right? The fact that I myself should choose them and share in them. And notice Jesus doesn't ever say, yo, I'm going to Jerusalem to die for you. He says, if you wish to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. He always says that his sacrifice is participatory. One of the great saints who shows us this is Saint Maria Magdalene de Pazi. I'm going to mess that name up tonight several times, but that's okay. She's a great Carmelite saint. Unfortunately not discalced. I don't think the discalced renovation or renewal had gotten to Italy yet, but she belonged to a reformed Carmelite community, Santa Maria dell'Angeli in Florence. She was a much younger contemporary to St. Teresa of Avila. She was about 50 years younger than St. Teresa of Avila. When she was 10 years old, she made her first communion. And she was so moved by what she received that she turned around and offered her virginity to God at that moment. And by the age of 16, had already entered the Carmelite community. And she entered the Carmelite convent that she did there in Florence because their rule of life said she could receive daily communion. And she wanted that so badly. You may be familiar that that was a rare thing before recently. And as she entered, she became deathly ill at a very young age. And so they rushed and professed her. She recovered and then went into ecstasy for 40 days. Like a crazy ecstasy. I love her to death, but she was running around with the crucifix yelling out love, love at the top of her throat. Like, I would have been like, okay, this is cool. But the sisters there understood what exactly was going on, right? And they appreciated and loved her, and they began to write down her words. They took all of her dictations. And one of the things that she said was she witnessed, she beheld in those 40 days Christ offering the sacrifice of the Eucharist and then dying the next day on the cross. And she talks a lot about that, about how his offering is meant for us to enter into, right? And she even says in ecstasy to her sisters, and this is something that I really want to spend some time with, she said that her physical suffering would come to an end because his physical suffering came to an end. But her internal sacrifice would be eternal. Her inward sacrifice would be eternal, because his inward sacrifice is eternal. And you know Jesus is still in heaven this day, not suffering, but still offering himself for us. So, dear brothers and sisters, I want to take a moment to kind of look at what she says there, look at the Eucharist, look at this idea of participating in the sacrifice of Christ, not using our prayers, not using our Mass, not using anything that we do, certainly not using the Novena as kind of a transaction with God that says, I'm going to jump through these hoops and therefore you're obligated to give me this, but rather a reality of opening our hearts and participating in the sacrifice, instead of letting it be done in place of us. As I was thinking about that, I thought about this nasal spray that I had to use this afternoon. I am on a lot of medicine right now, just so that you know, okay? So if I say anything weird, blame it on the medicine. And I had to open the nasal spray, and you may have encountered this yourself. The nasal spray was in this kind of plastic container. I don't know who makes these plastic containers. I wish they were the same people who made our defense network for the United States, okay? Because it required a chainsaw, a sledgehammer, and a blowtorch for me to get to my nasal spray. I was very upset, okay? And you may be aware of this also. When you buy something, it's like the simplest thing, and they put it in this kind of plastic container that it's nearly impossible to get into. You're like banging it against the shelf. You have to pull out scissors. You're ripping it. It's ridiculous. And I thought about that, and I thought about why we do sacrifice the way we do. In the bad way, I mean. It's because we have a natural instinct to protect ourselves. Just like that hard plastic casing was developed over and over and over again because things kept breaking. So the more we suffer, naturally, the thicker our defenses get. That's not a bad thing. That's a natural thing. It is, in some ways, a healthy thing, but it is an obstacle to growing in the path of Jesus Christ. Because the more and more I hide behind the plastic wrapping of my soul to protect myself, the more and more I'm going to approach this altar as a consumer rather than a Christian. As someone who holds myself back from the sacrifice and just tries to get something out of it. And dear brothers and sisters, that is a reality that all of us who are past the first fervor of our discipleship face. At least that's been my experience both as a man and as a pastor. That once that kind of first fire of offering passes, maybe we've tripped up, maybe we've suffered, maybe we've lost something that we've dearly cared for, and we become a lot more careful. And we come up with lots of footnotes to the idea of discipleship, right? And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Part of that is about learning prudence. I'm not telling you that you should therefore go out and act like a teenager in your first love. But I am saying, don't be as closed off as those stupid plastic packages. Okay? Because, dear brothers and sisters, part of being priest and sacrifice in communion with Christ at the altar is being willing to stand outside of ourselves. To be an observer, to be a consumer, all of that means that we're locked inside and things come into us. To be a priest and a victim means that we have to stand outside of ourselves. That's a scary thing. Does anybody know the Greek term for standing outside of yourself? Ekstasis. Ecstasy. Ecstasy literally means to step outside of yourself, to stand outside of yourself. And that's why St. Bernard of Clairvaux can say, love is ecstasy, and ecstasy is love, because love requires you to open the plastic package and step outside of yourself. And that's why St. Maria Magdalene de Pazi, who was filled with love, was in ecstasy, and she who was in ecstasy was filled with love. She was running around crying, love, 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 love. And she didn't just love Jesus from a distance. She didn't just love Jesus as an observer. She decided, she requested this beautiful thing. She said, I know that you're the incarnate Word, and I want to utter that word through me. She let Christ become in her so that she could live what St. Paul says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Jesus did not substitute for her. She participated in him. And dear brothers and sisters, when we come to the Eucharist today, presumably every day we do so, we remember that it is called communion, not substitution. Not only does Jesus offer himself in communion with us, he calls us into communion with him, to open up our hearts, to give ourselves completely as priest and sacrifice. Okay, I want to make this a little bit more concrete. That will involve suffering. But suffering is not the essence of sacrifice. Everybody with me? That will involve suffering, but suffering is not the essence of sacrifice. How do we know this? Because Christ descended into heaven is not suffering, and he's still offering sacrifice. And that's why St. Maria Magdalene de Pazi could say, hey, my physical suffering will have an end, but my internal sacrifice will be eternal. And so sometimes we look at sacrifice, and all we see when we hear the call of Jesus to the cross, all we see is the suffering. But the suffering is in fact accidental. It doesn't have to be there. It will always be there on earth. Don't go and say, Father Sensat said I can sacrifice without suffering. That's not what I said. I only say that to myself, okay? It's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that we need to focus not on the suffering, which is not of the essence of sacrifice, but on the love, which is. The love, which is what opens that plastic casing. The love, which is what makes us stand outside of ourselves. The love, which is what transforms a commercial transaction into an act of trust. Because, dear brothers and sisters, the reality of sacrifice, the reality of our gift to God is that there aren't set terms. There isn't a set price. There isn't an exchange of goods. We're not safe like the Romans were. We can't trick him like the Greeks did. We have to trust. We have to trust that we give him everything and he will give us everything. And that's not sacrifice as transaction. That's sacrifice as love. And so right at the heart of priest and sacrifice is the idea of love. And there can't be love like that without trust. And so this is why I'm talking about the idea of suffering. Like, yeah, suffering is going to be there, but if all you do is focus on the suffering, focus on the suffering, focus on the suffering, and say, like, God just wants me to suffer, 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 then guess what's going to happen? You're not going to what? Trust him. And your love will cool and die. And then you'll be wrapped up back in that plastic packaging. How do I know this? Because it happened to me. And I've been through that myself. And I had to come to understand and to know that God is good, that God is love, that God is not asking me to constantly suffer, but rather to constantly love. And yes, sometimes the consequences of love will be sacrifice and suffering. Sometimes the consequence of love will be suffering. We all know that. We all know that with every one of our friends, every one of our family members, that to love them means to make ourselves vulnerable. But none of our friends turn to us and say, I love you, so I want you to be miserable. Right? That's not what any of them say, and that's not what he says. He wants us to accept the suffering as a necessary consequence of the glory and the freedom of love. St. Augustine says this: as Christians, we're called not to love our suffering, but to endure it. We're called to love him. Now, I know that might make you feel uncomfortable because you've heard other things, and it's like, well, and I'm not denying that. I'm just trying to put a different spin on it so that you kind of have a different conception. Like, yes, suffering is very important, and we have to bear it as Christians, and we have to be willing to do it as Christians, but it's the consequence and the outside form. It's that plastic shell of the inner sacrifice of love. And that's what's essential. And that's what's essential. And so what we will see is that priest and victim nature of Christ, that he offers himself and is the one offered, is actually not just about him bearing the cross, but it's an inner reality of his entire nature. And this is going a little deep, but please follow me if you can. In the Trinity, every person of the Trinity, all three persons of the Trinity, give themselves to each other completely and receive the other persons completely. In the Trinitarian processions, there is the infinite gift of self and the infinite reception of the others. In the Eucharist, he gives himself to us completely and asks that we give ourselves to him completely in return. And so the reality, dear brothers and sisters, is that this sacrifice, this priesthood, this gift is not so that we can stand apart from God, but so that we can enter into God. Not so that we can stand apart from the sacrifice, but so that through the sacrifice we can be brought up into the infinite processions of love. Which is pretty cool, if you get and understand that. And so lastly, we turn to the Blessed Virgin Mary to see how she was both priest and sacrifice on Good Friday. And I want to compare her to someone who was a very important figure in the Old Testament, but also shows some of the ambiguity of sacrifice that took place there. That's Abraham. Abraham was called by God to sacrifice his only son, right? Horrible, huge, incredible. And yet Abraham accepts it, and yet when he brings his son Isaac, God himself provides a ram as a substitution. So remember, that substitution is still important. Good thing Abraham did not murder Isaac. We're happy about this. And yet Mary, the daughter of Abraham, stands at the foot of the cross. And God asks her to offer her only son. And she does. And tradition tells us that it's at that moment that she herself a sword shall pierce, right? That at that moment of offering her son on the cross, she herself was also pierced with his suffering. She herself became priest and victim, not in competition with him, but participating in his sacrifice. And she did it not with nails through her hands and feet, not by being decapitated or roasted on a gridiron. She did it completely through love. She loved him so much, and she loved us so much, that she too was turned into a complete sacrifice. I hope this has all made some sense to you. Like I said, I'm a little loopy because I'm on a lot of medicine. But dear brothers and sisters, I want you to really focus on that reality. The opening of our heart in love, which, yes, will include suffering on earth, but ultimately is about us not being locked in on ourselves, not covered by that plastic casing, not being someone who shrivels up inside, but someone who gives themselves completely to enter into that wonderful gift and regift of love that is the essence of God from all eternity. God bless you all.